A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, invitations of truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick on Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, something along the lines of the men of the Lord are a marveling sight to see. This is just based off conversation, a discussion with my elders, and pretty much normally when people come across the men of the Lord, they're very the people are very they marvel at you. They might they raise an eyebrow because they are looking at you from essentially a carnal perspective, because they look at you and then they might look at the way you conduct yourself, and they look at the way you speak, and they know something. They notice that there's essentially like a glitch in the matrix, because you don't fit the typical mold of a so-called Negro, Latino, Native American, or even the different Israelite foreigners that may not look like typical Israelites, right? Because this world's functions strongly on stereotypes, and there's a heavy emphasis of skin color, right? So the men of the Lord essentially break those strongholds, right? Not just by the way that they speak and how they discuss certain things and certain matters, but they don't fit the mold of what essentially Esau has created for you Israelites, because what the images that he has created essentially is an image that is not, it's very negative. It's very poor. It's not an image that is a very positive image, right? And essentially he's put himself up as the judges, as essentially the beacon of light, right? That's what the scriptures say. He covereth the faces of the judges thereof, right? So the top, the judge, Yahweh Shai, the Most High Yahweh, he's the face of those certain images, and he's essentially created a different webs of lies in regards to how these judges, how they moved, not just the image physically themselves, but that the vibration that comes behind that image, he's defaced all of that, right? So I just wanted to read a couple examples of men of the Lord that people marveled at, right? Let me just get the word marvel in the etymology here. Just bear with me 1 second. Excuse me. Okay, so marvel in the etymology, it says a miracle, the thing, act, or event which causes astonishment. It says a wonderful story or legend, a wonder, a surprise. It says wonderful things. It says wonderful, marvelous, extraordinary, strange, singular, a wonder at, from mirus. I'm guessing that's Latin. It says wonderful. So essentially, it's a strange sight to see, because the people of this world, they have certain so-called stereotypes, of how we look, right? And at the same time, the way, because you conduct yourself in a higher vibration, these people, it confounds them, because like for example, the so-called black man, they assume you're supposed to actually like sports, be good at sports, and that's pretty much just be somebody who's like a court jester or an entertainer, right? But when they hear you and you speak very well, and you speak on certain topics, whether it might be history or geography, certain things, without discussing the scriptures, but it might be in the scriptures. They find it very like, oh, man, this guy is very, this guy, there's something about him. The scriptures say that. The scriptures say a man should be known by his. Let me get that first. Hold on, and then I'll get the first account. I just wanted to grab a couple accounts of certain marveling sights to see of different examples of the men of the Lord, right? So let me just go to the Sirach, the I believe that's 19. Okay, this is Sirach chapter 19, verse 29. And it says, a man may be known by his look, and one that hath understanding by his countenance when thou meetest him. A man's attire, excessive laughter, and gait show what he is, right? So, the way the having that understanding, because once you have more understanding, regards to who you are, your nationality, your heritage, and then the condition that you're in, one of the things is when you have a lot of wisdom, it causes a lot of grief. So it changes your eyesight. You're not as easily impressed by a lot of the folly, because the scriptures talk about folly is set in great dignity, because that's what this kingdom actually offers. It's a tremendous amount of folly, and you can see that in their people's conversation. And when you go into the word, conversation refers to a manner of life. So when you hear these people speak, it's a very, very dull vibration. They're operating on a very low vibration of thinking, right? A very carnal, beast-like vibration. It's really just strictly talking about sex and entertainment, and pleasures and so on and so forth, but nothing actually of substance and value. You know what I'm saying? So, verse 13, it says, a man's attire, excessive laughter, and gait show what he is, right? So you tend to be less impressed by a lot of these people's conversations, right? That's why the scriptures talk about how Lot was vexed with the filthy conversations of the wicked. Hearing their lifestyle and hearing their the way that they speak, it changes. You remove yourself from these people, right? You don't laugh as much, it's not like we're not like we're robots, but at the same time, these people are completely useless eaters, like the elites like to say, right? That gait refers to just the way you walk, right? Not in the physical sense, but like in an upright sense, because that's what happens when you actually have more of an understanding of your heritage, because you conduct yourself more uprightly, because Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents, right? So he was more type of person. We were supposed to be created to be morally upright. You know what I'm saying? So let me get the first example. And Lord's will, this lesson will just be quick and edifying. This is Luke chapter 2. I'll start at verse 41, and I'll just read down, to the point. So it says, visit to Jerusalem. And so it says, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, speaking of Yahushua, when they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast, and when they had fulfilled the days that they returned, the child Yahushua tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew not of it, so he stayed back, right? And it says, but they, supposing that they have been in the company, and went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinfolk and acquaintance. Verse 45. And it says, and when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him. And it came to pass, after 3 days, they found him in a temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and answering them questions. And they all heard him, and go back into the word marvel in the etymology. This is what they said. This is how they felt, I should say. And it says, and all they that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. So this is so they found him. Yahushua was in the temple, being such at a young age, which at that point, he's in ancient times. At that point, you actually start to become more of a man anyway, right? It wasn't really based on the knowledge of this world, because the knowledge of this world, you're a man, at the legal age of 18. The same thing for women also, right? And he went, because he was about his father's business. He just began teaching, right? So but the point really is that he was in the midst, sitting amongst doctors and people who have titles. People have all these different, how do you call that, I guess you can say prestige of this world. And he was confounding them, because like they were very shocked at his answers. And the people, when you speak to people, it's the same thing. When you're able to draw certain kinds of inferent parallels between speaking about something in a parabolic sense, and you be able to see more more insight, because when you tap into the spirit, you'll be able to make certain connections that these people are not able to make, because the scriptures say we have an unction from the Holy One to know all things, right? So an unction, when you research that word specifically, it goes into an anointing, right? So having that understanding to be able to see these different see these different things from the Holy Spirit, right? So I make these certain connections, right, to see the way how Yahushua talk. He spoke in parables and so on and so forth, you know and it's the same way people get very astonished by that, because a lot of the Jews, the scribes and Pharisees, a lot of times when Yahushua spoke, he when he spoke, it went over their heads, and they took it, what should I say, they took it very carnally, right? For example, like drinking my blood and so on and so forth. They took it, and eating my flesh, right? When they heard those things, they kind of like, is this guy talking about cannibalism? You know what I'm saying? But it wasn't. They were just too carnal. So they were, the carnal mind can't receive the things of the spirit, right? So they weren't, essentially they weren't spiritually discerned, so they couldn't receive a lot of the things Yahushua spoke of, right? So that's one of the reasons a lot of our people, they marvel a lot of the things they say, because when you speak in a parable, you speak in, use certain languages, and even it could be things that are everyday usage, like that's a very common thing you might see in the scriptures, men, as being parallel to, like, compared to trees, and so on and so forth. They use the earth to make certain things, trees, how they have roots and they grow and so on and so forth, right? They made some parallels like that. That's not, even Jake does that on on a musical perspective. But the point is, when you speak in that kind of way, people tend to marvel at the men of the Lord because of that, right? So um let me go to, okay, I want to go to Chronicles. Okay, this is Second Chronicles 9 verse 1. And it says, this is the visit from the Queen of Sheba. So this it says in it, and then when the Queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon, she came to prove Solomon with hard questions at Jerusalem, with a very great company, and camels that bear spices, and gold, and abundance of precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all her questions, and there was nothing from Solomon which he told her not. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon and the house he had built, the meat of his table, the sitting of his servants, the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers also, and their apparel, and his ascent by which they went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Let me get that. Let me see how it says it in another translation. Because she's being marveled by what King Solomon did. He actually had the blueprint to actually build the temple, right? And King Solomon, he used a lot of the different resources, but one of the main things I want to highlight, was that one of the things he prayed for, was wisdom, right? And let me see how that last portion of how she actually so okay, I want to read that from verse 4 in the NLT, and it says, and she was overwhelmed, and she was also amazed at the food on his tables, the organization of his officials and their splendid clothing, the cupbearers and their robes, and the burnt offerings Solomon made at the temple of the Lord. She exclaimed to the king, everything I heard from my country about your achievement and wisdom is true, right? So, she was marveled at, the arrangement, not just how the house of the Lord was built, the temple, but also seeing their clothing, how well they were decked out, because Solomon was decked out spiritually, first and foremost within his mind, right? That was part of his prayer. He said to the Lord, I am but a child, give me the wisdom to properly instruct these people, to roughly paraphrase, right? And that's one of the things that's missing from our people as a culture, is really wisdom, because the scriptures say how wisdom truly is the principal thing, right? Now that's something that he prayed for, right? Speaking about Solomon here, right? So and that's one of the things also that makes that makes a man's face to shine, right? That's why people marvel at the men of the Lord, because sometimes you have I want to get another example, right? They may not look like all they may not look all flashy, but when they speak, people, their spirit is like, sometimes it's stirred up, right? So I'll read this last verse here, and it says, I didn't believe what was said until I arrived and I saw it with my own eyes. In fact, I have not heard of half of your great wisdom. It is far beyond from what I was told, right? So, she was told, she heard all these different things about, King Solomon. She came and, she brought her little, spices and so on and so forth, right? And, she was essentially, she had questions for him, right? So that's one of the things, and that would make people would marvel at you, is because of desiring wisdom, right? And that starts first and foremost with the fear of the Lord, because ultimately in this society, people don't even have that. Something as simple as, like, I remember we were discussing like the dietary law. There's no reason for shellfish to be on the shelves in grocery stores, but people might think that's crazy because you're carnal. But once you understand why the Lord created those foods, you understand there is a place for them. And that's people think, and people marvel at that, because they don't even understand that level, have that level of understanding. The Lord's ways are ultimately higher than our ways, right? So having that understanding, you understand more of order, you understand more why certain things need to be in the place where they should be. And what Esau has done is pretty much change and disregarded the Lord's instruction, because this world needs proper instruction to be able to keep it and dress it and maintain it, right? So I'll get one last, I wanted to get one last verse actually, because sometimes, to a point I made earlier, we sometimes we dress in a particular way, but people really take in, most of the way, like how we dress, right? But when you speak, they're marveled, at, the knowledge, of what you might know, right? A lot of our people, they tend to look down on you also. They figured, okay, sometimes you might be a know-it-all, and it's crazy too, because, and that's the whole irony too, because that shows you the knowledge of the Lord, is really and truly limitless, because, you know when you look at the knowledge of this world, there is a, what's the word, there's like a ceiling, to it, but when you think about, when you look at things a lot more spiritually, there's no ceiling, right? So this is Acts chapter 4, verse 13, and it says, and when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Yahushua, right? So, even the disciples, because, drawing the point from Peter specifically, because I believe it was Peter that was a fisherman, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just double check. Matthew 4. Yes, so it was Peter and Andrew. They were throwing their nets in the water, right? So yeah, so they were fishermen. So imagine, and those are like blue collar jobs. What they will consider today blue collar jobs. Those men were looking. They might have looked a little bit rough on the edges and so on and so forth. A lot of us don't work a lot of prestigious white collar jobs. And when I say white collar, I'm talking about like more corporate, CEO type of positions. Even though you had a lot of our people back then that had high ranking positions, right? Not a lot of us had a lot of those positions, right? So the Lord, he chooses, he deals a lot with the lowly, right? The lowly men, right? So those kinds of men, it confounds people. It's kind of like you're a glitch in the matrix, because people can't understand that. They're like, yo, he looks a certain way but he speaks another way, so you don't really fit the mold of what their standard of a so-called Black, Latino, Native American, or if you look like the other nation, you don't fit the standard, right? You're like an outlier. There's something, not that there's something wrong with you, it's just that in their minds they can't put you in a box, right? So that's pretty much, the point. I kind of just wanted to hit that, but one of the things that, that might happen, within, people reacting to you, is that, they tend to glitch up. They tend to they don't fully understand, right? So anyways, Lord's will, this lesson was just a quick edifying, right? It just shows the importance of, really and truly just shows the importance of wisdom, right? But anyways, because that's what makes us adorned, right? So anyways, Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.